Hi, everybody. Well, here we are at week 5, which means we've gotten over the halfway mark of this course. And I'm really loving reading all of your digitization projects and ideas and the way you're working through things. You're doing such a great job. I love learning about how you're thinking about things. As always, I'm here for any questions, but you guys are really getting the hang of it. I'm hoping and kind of guessing that you're finding that the actual digitization, like the scanning part of the scanning project, of a digitization project, is maybe pretty time consuming. That part will be time consuming in a real project, but it's actually one of the more straightforward parts of the process. The planning, the permissions, and everything else is what really takes so much like thinking and brain power, right? So this week we're moving into what happens after you scan those items that we've been talking about, and that is description or metadata. And many of you, if not all of you, are from a library background and have some idea of what metadata is and how it applies to items that we're, sharing in our organizations. So this is going to be, just as with all of our other topics, this is going to be a pretty high level overview. There's links to more resources in the Digital Readiness Toolkit and on the syllabus. And if you want more, information beyond what's described here in this unit, of course, please feel free to reach out with anything specific, and I will try to put you in touch with whatever resources you need. So this week we're going to talk about file naming, which for those of you who have worked in digital archives before, this is going to be a little bit of a review. So feel free to fast forward through that part if you'd like. We're going to talk about where you keep the information that you decide about file naming and folder structures, which is in a data dictionary. We're going to talk about metadata standards for digital archival materials, controlled vocabularies, which we're all pretty familiar with, I think, from a library standpoint. But we're going to talk about here how it applies to digital materials. We're going to talk a fair amount about considering the power that one has when one is writing metadata and descriptive information. And then I want to go over this week's assignment just a little bit because it's a little bit different than what we've been doing. So let's get into file naming first. I saw a few of you talking about file naming in the discussion board, which is great. I'm glad that you're talking about it. And very good news, even if you have started with less than ideal file names, it's not too difficult to go back and rename and fix it and kind of start with a new file naming convention. So for those of you who don't know, or just to clarify, a digital file name of a digital item on your computer is not the same thing as the title of an item. That digital file name is, how it's stored in a file on your desktop or in your documents or whatever on your computer. The title is what you're going to put in the metadata spreadsheet, which we'll talk about in just a couple minutes. So, when creating a digital file in any format, what's the one thing we have to know that happens with those file names when we're comparing one to another? They have to be unique, right? If you try to name something the exact same name as something else in the same folder, the computer won't even let you do it. It wants to add a number or the word copy or something. So, the first thing we have to do is assign a unique identifier to each file. It's not a great idea to just create something out of thin air every time we create a new digital file. You can do that if you want to, but it's much better to use a consistent standard to help the computers and people organize your files, find your files, and to minimize duplication. And what we have here is an example of what I would call not ideal file naming. So file names should not be descriptive as they are here in this example. Poorly written file names become really difficult to find after just a few days of working in a digital project. These kinds of file names require someone with the knowledge of exactly how they were formed to be able to find them ever again. If you're the only person who's ever going to work on this project and that's really how you want to do it, I mean, go for it. But this is going to be difficult to sustain going forward. So, this is an example generously provided by the La Crosse Public Library here in Wisconsin. They also provided a great example of what file names should look like. So this is a really solid file naming convention here. And if we're looking at each one of these file names and the elements in the file names, we can guess at what they might mean. So you don't have to do your file naming convention this way, but let me show you a little bit about how this one comes together. So the PC in the file name stands for photo collection in this case. The 003 stands for which photo collection it is, which is their third photo collection. There's a couple of numbers in here that indicate a physical shelf location. So this is photo collection 3. These items are they're in a box that's on the shelf number 1. They're in box number 1. And then the items are numbered with the 001, 002. B here refers to the back of an item. So these might be postcards, for instance, or the back of a photograph. And enhanced refers to the items being not the original primary file. These are like photoshopped or cropped, or maybe they're color corrected or something beyond just real minimal. Correction that you get at the time of digitization, like we talked about last week. Now, you don't have to include a physical location element in your file names. That can be part of a separate spreadsheet or database record, or perhaps it doesn't apply at all if what you have is a fully digital collection with no physical counterpoint. But this is one example of what file naming could look like. A little bit more information here about things to do when you're choosing file naming. Whatever it is that you're going to choose, be consistent. So it doesn't have to be exactly the way that we're going to look at examples, but it just does need to work for you. It needs to be easily understandable and ideally easily teachable. And then you're going to document those file naming rules and share them with anyone in your organization who would need to get on board with that file name structure. And the reason that there are a bunch of zeros in front of the numbers in the file names is so that they can be sorted properly when you're trying to sort within a computer file, so that when you hit, sort by file name, that they'll be in order, either ascending or descending order, whatever you select, so that you don't have something like a file named 1 followed by a file named 11 instead of a file named 2. There's a couple of examples on this slide about how you can generate other file naming conventions. And my advice to you is to consider what you and others in your organization are going to need to know when you're looking for a digital file. So, what pieces of information are important? Is it dates? Is it what library it comes from? So, for instance, in this example over here on the left, um, in this case, it's important for this, it's a library system in this case. They need to know which library this is coming from in their system first and foremost. So for them, they need to know it's coming from Crandon Public Library. In that situation, it's a library system, and they sort their materials by which library in the system that it comes from. And then they need to know the collection, and then they need to know the item number. And this other example here on the right, this comes from a community archive I've been working with my high school theater program. And in this situation, we're digitizing materials from the last like 30 or 40 years of the high school's theater program. And the questions that we get asked all the time usually have to do with either the production or the year. So, like, hey, I need a photo from this particular production. And in this case, the productions are sometimes repeated every decade or 2 decades. So the date is really important, which means in this case, I want to be able to sort by dates. So we put the dates first, and then the name of the production, and then the serialized number. Um, Note that in none of these cases are we putting any description in the file name itself, which we're going to talk about in just a little bit. A couple of things not to do in your file naming convention. Don't use file names in place of database records. So as I just mentioned, file names are not where you put a bunch of descriptive information. That's what databases and spreadsheets are for, which is what your assignment this week is going to be about. And then a couple of logistical things. Make sure your file names are readable by machines. And so even though a lot of computers these days will allow you to make a document name, a file name, a folder name that has spaces or periods in it, we don't want to do that when you're working with digital collections materials, because content management systems or places that you're going to put these files might not be able to read those spaces or periods. So use underscores or dashes instead. and don't use any special characters like colons, slashes, etc. So once you've got all this information figured out, you need to document it, right? And everything else we're going to talk about this week also goes into a data dictionary. It's really just a well organized list of instructions that tells anybody else who might be working on this project either with you or after you what are the meanings and the purposes of all the elements within your project, and it provides guidance on how to go forward with these things. So it could be things like documenting what your file naming convention looks like, your folder naming and structure, why your digital folders are set up the way they are, any local vocabulary, like, if there's somebody who is a person or a character in your town, or that, often shows up in this context. That you want to make sure is named properly in all of the metadata. That kind of local vocabulary goes into your data dictionary. Any punctuation rules, sources of controlled vocabularies, which we're going to talk about in a second, which field is for which information, what metadata standard you're using, all of that kind of thing. So this essentially ensures that everyone working on the digital collection is going to be entering the description and the titles the same way every single time. Okay, more about that in part two.